Okay, hello and welcome to this week's Counterfire meeting. And tonight we've got Tom Griffiths talking about the breakup of the UK.
So it's a lot to talk about, Britain breaking up in 20 minutes, so forgive bits that I may or may not skirt over. I think before we get into the Scottish referendum, which is obviously going to be the kind of cornerstone of what we talk about tonight, as it's kind of a real pressing concern at the minute, I do want to give a little bit of historical background. I'm not going to give you the history of Great Britain since the Neolithic, but it is worth reminding ourselves that the British state is a state made up of four nations under the control of one nation, England. It is not a kind of amicable meeting of equals in any sense at all. And that's, I think, absolutely central to everything that we think about for the rest of the meeting. I want to say a tiny bit about Wales, because I'm just saying we've got a Welsh table at the top here today. My dad's Welsh. You know, and even Wales, which kind of gets forgotten about, it is, of course, is a separate nation. If you want to find a keen marker of what defines a separate nation, it's somewhere that usually has a separate language, which Wales does. And all those picturesque castles are all Edwardian castles, which are quite literally outposts, occupation of an occupation army in the 1200s. So that's and believe you me, Welsh people remember that shit. Ireland, there's so much to say about Ireland. Again, I'm just going to skirt through just and pick out the one kind of key thing I think is absolutely vital in understanding. You know, is what Northern Ireland is and how new it is as a nation in its own right. It was only born in, or created in 1921, and it was born out of the Irish War of Independence. It was born out of violence, it was born out of blood, and it was so unpopular that it kicked off another 2 years of civil war until 23. And it's incredibly contentious at its birth and still incredibly contentious today, and it was clearly gerrymandered state as well. It's something like 11 different districts, and a predominance which are loyalist and Protestant, but they're tiny versus the vast big districts of Catholic Irish areas. You know, and of course that's the root of the civil rights movement in the 60s and the Troubles and so on, and again these things are so well known I won't talk about them, but worth reminding ourselves that one of those constituent parts of the British state is a recent invention and is one born out of blood and violence and chaos. Scotland. Well, Scotland's always often kind of talked about, well, you can't, people often say things like, well, you can't talk about Scotland in quite the same kind of way. You know, the Union of 1707 was a peaceful, amicable affair, and you know, it's not a history of colonial oppression in the same way as the relationship with Ireland. I mean, that is just complete nonsense. It completely overlooks not only hundreds of years of violence and oppression as well, but it overlooks the fact that 30 years after the Union in 1707, you've got the Jacobite Rising, and you've got a huge layer of Scots wanting to shake off that rule. And if there's a fantastic film recommendation, Culloden, Peter Watkins, 1964, talks about the Battle of Culloden, which ended the Jacobite Rising, but also talks very movingly about the repression of the English army of the Scottish population in the area as well. So that's the relationship that England has to all of its constituent parts. That's what makes up the British state. So a bit of history just to sort of underpin everything that we talk about from now on. So I'm going to step right forward in time to 2014 with the first Scottish referendum, because that's where we're kind of really at and about. And I think it's really useful to talk about why it was called and on what grounds it was fought and won or lost. The Scottish ruling class has always had kind of a mixed attitude to the English ruling class, to the British state, and obviously in many ways there's large elements of the Scottish ruling class which is very pro the British state. You know, it's very proud of its heritage of the empire and all the rest of it, and you know, it's Scottish regiments out in the Raj and all this kind of stuff, and of course the Queen goes on her holidays to Scotland all the time, so there is this kind of very close relationship, but also you know, the Scottish, there's lots of layers of Scottish capital who quite clearly see that they would do far better, thank you very much, if they're able to control things much nearer to home than all the way down in Westminster. So that's partly where the desire from that end of society comes from for independence. And of course that's where the SNP come from. They are a party, a bourgeois party, aligned with Scottish capital. So that's the kind of reason that they're pro it. But in the process of that referendum in 2014, a bit of a shift started to happen, and we started to see another set of reasons for people fighting desperately for independence. And of course it's left-wing reasons, and it's the working class. You know, most people aren't in 2014 or nor now desperately trying to free themselves from the oppressive yoke of, you know, the English boot kind of thing, but they are trying to free themselves from English capital, as seen, even if not necessarily expressed in that way. I mean, it became very clear that some of the most solid yes areas were Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee, big working class areas, and they were voting yes for anti-austerity reasons, for anti-Tory reasons, and for taking control away from the Tory elite in Westminster. And that's like a new dynamic which had a huge positive impact on the campaign in favour of a yes vote. Early predictions at the beginning of the campaign, as you'll remember, were, well, you know, it's not going to be particularly close. And in the end, although no did win, as we know, 55 to 45%, a much, much smaller margin than we expected. And as I say, you know, not just fought on the kind of hollow kind of William Wallace kind of Braveheart, Mel Gibson kind of ticket, but really sold on some quite radical ideas. Obviously the Radical Independence Campaign being very key in all of that. So now we're in a situation where that's a topic that is kind of, you know, can happen again. You know, the referendum has been talked about by Sturgeon. Again, now she planned that she would do this back before she even took over from Alex Salmond. She said, look, the SNP is going to push for another referendum if the United Kingdom votes to leave the EU. So it's part of a long-term strategy. And I think it's another way in which we can see where the SNP is aligned itself to capital. It is the party that wants Scottish capital to have more control in its own area, but absolutely maintain all of its kind of ongoing trading links with its trading partners in the EU and so on. I mean, that's what it is, the SNP is interested in. However, again, looking at those kind of core areas that were the most solidly yes, there's new data coming out now, and actually scribbled it down on a separate piece of paper, so I don't have the numbers in front of me. But it's now looking quite clear that actually in some of those working class communities in places like Glasgow, where it's very, very heavily yes, there's also quite a large preponderance of no in the of leave in the EU referendum. And that's a slightly different dynamic than Sturgeon has called the referendum on. Actually, again, you know, it's the same people who are voting yes in the Scottish referendum to boot the Tories in Westminster. We're also thinking along the same kind of lines regards the EU referendum as well. Let's give Westminster a good kick-in. So, for those reasons, also there will be layers of Scottish business that is very, very worried about Brexit, that will kind of, you know, feed into a yes campaign should it happen soon, that wasn't necessarily. And of course the other factor in all of this is that the Labour Party is completely annihilated in Scotland now, and obviously it was very, very active in campaigning for the no vote last time around. They're going to have much less resources and much less clout in that regard. So it does look, I would suggest, that if it does happen again, it looks pretty likely that the EU, the Scottish referendum will go into a yes direction. Now, what do we feel about that as a left? Well, first thing I think we need to do is talk about some of the things that people will say, you know, even on the left, about why we should maintain the union, and we'll get these kind of conference people will have these kind of things and say this kind of stuff to us all the time. And the key thing will always be this sort of sense of, well, we're stronger together. Well, we need to like really kind of pick that apart and go, well, stronger in what way and stronger for who? I mean, even people on the left, and I heard people saying it last time, like, oh my God, what are we going to do if, you know, we lose this big block of Scottish Labour and it's all going to be Tory forever and all this kind of stuff. Well, that ship has sailed already. The Scottish Labour Party is non-existent pretty much now, so that argument doesn't work. Another argument in terms of the stronger together things, often about economic powers being stronger together. Well, I mean, that doesn't necessarily hold up either. You can look at a country like Denmark, which is a population of 5.5 million. Scotland's population is 5.3, not massively different. And Denmark's GDP is bigger than the UK's is put together already, and so per capita, so quality of life, at least in those terms, is already better. So these arguments don't really work. Of course, what stronger together usually means is the British state, the establishment, is stronger. And that's something as socialists, of course, that we should be very, very clear about, that we're not in favour of. We're not in favour of a stronger establishment. It's what we spend all of our time and energy combating. Why on earth do we want to kind of prop up the thing that we're on our demonstrations, on signing our petitions and all the rest of it, to kind of support? And this idea that somehow we should sort of have a stronger working class because, you know, we're all in the same big state is also bonkers. It seems to me that one of the things we can do in terms of solidarity with working class people in Scotland is support them in their demands for greater autonomy, for self-determination, and for greater democratic control and so on. And also, if the independence campaign is being fought along those terms of anti-austerity, kicking the Tories, all this kind of stuff, then again, solidarity with that campaign is about working class people coming together. You know, that seems to me very clear. And we do it, and that's why we do it, on internationalist principles. I'm just getting a quote by Mr. Lenin. And he wrote in 1913 his thesis on the national question. And this is very, very interesting, I think, in terms of where we are, a lot to learn from it. He said, we as socialists, we defend the right of all nationalities to self-determination. Our business is to struggle for full democracy and the annulment of all national privileges. He goes on to say, socialists therefore must give most emphatic warning to the proletariat against direct deception by the nationalistic slogans of their own bourgeoisie, who with their saccharine or fiery speeches about our native land try to divert its attention from their own bourgeois intrigues, while they enter into economic and political alliance with the bourgeoisie of other nations themselves, which is exactly what the SNC wants to do with the EU. It wants to have its cake and to eat it. It wants to play on all of this kind of nationalist kind of rhetoric and Mel Gibson with blue on his face and this kind of stuff, whilst at the same time maintaining its links with other bourgeois powers in the EU and trading partners and so on and so forth. So it's, you know, it's one kind of relationship and not the other in its own way. Then it goes on to say the proletariat cannot pursue its struggle for socialism and defend its everyday economic interests without the closest and fullest alliance of the workers of all nations. And so there's the kind of interesting kind of two sides to that coin, and I think that's the way we need to look at it too. The two sides being that on the one hand you think of yourself as a socialist, as an internationalist, thinking about supporting people across borders, but on the other hand, you absolutely support people's right to self-determination in the same breath. But we should think about this even further and not just say, well, let's support Scottish working class people's right to vote yes in independence and say, yes, nice one, well done, if they do decide to do that. We should actively support it. And why should we do that? As I've said, we are not a group of people that want to support a strong British state. So let's look at the key reasons in ways in which over this side of the border we will benefit massively if Scotland does become independent. And the first way which we're going to benefit is, as anti-war campaigners, the British state is going to lose its direct control over things like Trident up there. It's going to lots of military bases and all this. It's going to seriously undermine its stature as a world power, in that sense that it's able to maintain a special relationship with America and all the rest of it. All of these things, again, we're busy campaigning about in Stop the War Coalition and so on and so forth. If England separates from Scotland, it's going to create a huge crisis in the British state. It's not going to be able to present itself on the world stage as this great military power as it once was able to do. And if we're socialists and we're anti-war activists, this is a good thing. This is something that we should welcome and support and force down the line. We don't want a British state that is able to continue its so-called special relationship and continue its continuous wars throughout the world, specifically in the Middle East and elsewhere. We don't want those things. If the British state as it is, which, as I said in my opening remarks, is one completely born out of hundreds of years of violence and oppression of the worst possible kind, we do not want this institution to be able to thrive and to flourish and to be strong. So finally, the simple thing is the title rather for the meeting is Britain breaking up? Well, looking at it, if we do have another Scottish referendum, very possibly. Do we want it to? Absolutely.